Welcome back to our study of Leviticus. Today we get to talk about a portion of the Bible that most of us are, if we're familiar with it because we have friends who are Jewish and they celebrate the holy days or the festivals of the Jewish calendar. It is Leviticus chapter 23, and we're going to look at how Israel was called by God to regulate their year. And I'd really like to break this down in a few different ways with you. I want to talk first of all about what we see, what were these major days and festivals, and then we'll talk about why they did these things and about how we can read this today. So what, why, and how is our breakdown for today. And I'm not going to read the entirety of the chapter to you this time, but I do encourage you to read it. And if you haven't, then press pause now, read it, and then come back. And what you see in this chapter as far as the what is 2 days and then 3 festivals. And the first day is just the Sabbath day. This is a weekly rhythm where the people were called on the 7th day not to do regular work. And so it starts out by giving us a heading that says, "The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies." And the first one is Sabbath. There are 6 days when you may work, but the 7th day is a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work wherever you live. It is a Sabbath to the Lord. And so what you have here is the people who are called to rest. This was an act of trust. This was an act of faith in God, that even when they stopped working, that he would continue spinning the globe, that he would continue, they didn't think about spinning the globe, but he would continue providing what they needed in order for life to go on, even though they themselves were taking a break. And then you've got the 3 major festivals and another really important day. So the breakdown that you find in the text is so first festival is Passover or Pesach. So we'll talk about what we see when we look at the festival of Passover. And then the next festival is Pentecost. And then actually in order, you've got the Day of Atonement, but I'll go ahead and bracket it out. It's just walking through the calendar. The 3 major festivals, I want them to be in order here. So you have the Festival of Tabernacles and then the Day of Atonement. Now, this day falls there in the calendar year, but I think conceptually that you have these 3 main days and then these 3 main festivals and then these 2 particular days. So let's talk through them. Again, the Sabbath is anchored in creation and it's anchored in redemption. Because God rested on the 7th day, he calls people to rest on the 7th day. Because God delivered his people from bondage in Egypt, they are to take the 7th day off and to be different. They're to do this for themselves, for their manservants, maidservants, animals, land, all these various things. And once again, it is about trusting in God's provision apart from our productivity. It is very easy to become addicted to productivity, and not so much because we like to be addicted to productivity, although some of us maybe do, but because initially we think, if I don't keep working, then we won't have enough. And the Sabbath is God's way of saying, no, if you don't keep worshiping, then you won't have enough. So put me first and do this in concrete ways by every week taking the last day off. Then you come to the 3 major festivals. These are all festivals in which, if it was possible for you to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, you would do so. The first one is Passover. Its Hebrew name is Pesach, and you can see it there in chapter 23, verses 4 through 14. You've got different aspects of this particular festival. This was a festival that celebrated God's deliverance of the people from Egypt. You may remember the story. Israel is in bondage to Egypt under Pharaoh. God, through Moses, calls Pharaoh to let the people go. Moses kind of wavers, and in the end, he refuses, then he wavers, then he refuses, then he says go, then he refuses, and in the end, after God takes the life of the firstborn of all in Egypt, he says, get out of here. And so then they go, and then he changes his mind and chases them. You can read the story in Exodus if you've not read it. And this last day, this day of Passover, was a yearly time of commemorating when God delivered his people. And, the reason why we call it Passover is because the Israelites were to slay a lamb and to put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their houses. And then when God's destroying angel would go throughout Egypt and take the life of the firstborn, he would pass over the Israelites. And so it was an indication of God's atoning blood that he would provide. It was an indication of his deliverance from bondage. Huge festival, in many ways the most important festival of the year. And it would happen on the 14th day of the first month. And it is the first month because this actually is the time that establishes the Hebrew calendar. It was a 7-day festival. And so for 7 days, they would eat unleavened bread. They would Sabbath on the first and the seventh day of this week, and each day of the week they would offer these daily offerings of gratitude to the Lord. And again, you can read about the details in the text, but for a week long, they would be offering these offerings on a daily basis and remembering what God had done for them. And then you come to the end of that week, and you have this really important moment on day 8 when you offer the first fruits of the harvest. And so this was a festival that would take place in the spring. Kind of our April, May usually is when Passover falls. And so you would just now be bringing in the first fruits of the harvest, and you would offer them to the Lord as a wave offering, as a way of saying, thank you for providing for us. This is just the first of much blessing that you will continue to bring our way. So that is Passover. Pentecost gets its name because of time. It's actually about 50 days after the Passover. And so basically, you were supposed to add 50 days to the end of the Passover, 7 times 7, 7 sevens or 7 weeks, and then the next day you would begin it. And it was a celebration of the arrival of Israel at Mount Sinai, where they received the law from God. And so you can see that you're just sort of walking through the narrative. And the reason why it was that time period is because that's how long it took. So they kind of symbolized this journey by 50 days later, celebrating the receiving of the law. This one was one where you would offer leavened bread to the Lord this time with a number of sacrifices. And because we're studying Leviticus, we know about the burnt offering and the sin offering and the peace offering. And those were the ones that were offered, each with very specific things. And once again, we remember that this symbolizes God's forgiveness and atonement of the people. It symbolizes their cleansing so that they can be a place fit for his presence. It symbolizes their gratitude and their celebration of the peace that God has effected with them. And so after you offer these sacrifices, you take part in a Sabbath day. And then there's a specific instruction in there as well that you are not to glean the edges of your field, but rather to leave those for the poor who can come and receive food that they need. In the same way that God has taken care of you by delivering you from slavery and by giving you his law, you also are to take care of those among you who are not able to take care of themselves. So those are the spring festivals, and then it jumps ahead. And I'm going to keep walking through the festivals, and then we'll circle back around to the Day of Atonement. The Tabernacles Feast and the Day of Atonement take place on the 7th month. And so it's this sort of important moment because 7 is always this symbol of completeness. And in the Festival of Tabernacles, it began midway through the 7th month. And what you were supposed to do was you were supposed to live in tents for a week. And so for a week, you would do no regular work. You would live in these temporary shelters, which was a reminder of God guiding his people through the temporary shelters that they constructed in the wilderness. So on their way, they've been delivered from Egypt. They've received the law, but they've got this long journey through the wilderness. And it is important for generations of Jews to remember this long journey through the wilderness where God led them by pillar of cloud and fire, where God fed them by manna and quail, where God taught them and took care of them even in spite of themselves. And so what you're doing for each day of the Feast of Tabernacles is you're offering these daily offerings and celebrations. And then once again on day 8, after the week is over, you offer this offering. Now, those are the 3 feasts, but of course the Day of Atonement happens in between Pentecost and Tabernacles. It's on the first day of the 7th month, and it is announced with trumpets. There's no work, there's no eating. It's a day of fasting, and we talked about this a few sessions ago, so you can go back if you can't remember the details and look at our session on Leviticus 16. So this was the calendar year of the Jews. Every week they would take part in Sabbath Sabbath rest. And then at various points along the year, they would have these important festivals. Passover and Pentecost sort of work together. And then the Day of Atonement and Tabernacle sort of work together as well. That was their calendar. That's the what. I want to, as I said, talk about both the why and the how. Why did they do this? And how should we read this today? How should we hear this today? Is there anything that we should do today in terms of practicing what we see? There's a couple of things I want to mention under the why. One would be, it has to do with memory. So it is important to manage our memories. Whatever dominates your memory defines your mindset. We're all familiar with the phrase, the ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it, but yet most of us remain fairly ignorant of history. If you have read the Psalms very much, you've seen that there's this refrain throughout the Psalms of remembering the great things that God has done for us in the past so that we can understand what we may be going through in this particular moment. And I find it valuable here, maybe it's just because I'm a teacher, to think about the way memory and learning work. And sometimes when we're trying to learn something or when we're trying to be shaped by particular ideas, it can be frustrating that it's hard to remember, that we forget. And our minds are actually made to forget, because if you weren't capable of forgetting, then you would go crazy. Because if you think about all the stimulus that you take in on a daily basis and all of the things that you've ever learned, if those were all swirling around your head all the time, we don't have the brain capacity to manage that much information. And so we are constantly forgetting things in order to survive. And that's just how we're built. And the way in which you learn something is by interrupting the forgetting process. This is why cramming for a test doesn't really help, because you interrupted the forgetting process once, took a test, and then forgot it again. But if you can quiz yourself on the material over a period of time, the best way to learn, as they say in language acquisition, is to let yourself forget and then come back and learn it again. And it solidifies it in your long-term memory so that you don't just know it, but you know it. And this is where it's valuable for me to think about the value of these various things. Is that whatever dominates your memory really is going to define your mindset. And if your memory over the course of months and years is dominated by weekly Sabbath and this yearly Day of Atonement and these 3 big parties that celebrate all that God has done for you, then that's going to shape the way you think about the world. The second thing to recognize, certainly related to it, but it's just a question of calendar. Man, when I write the word calendar, I don't know about you, I think of Google Calendar, and I don't know what I would do without it. And I think the point here is that whatever regulates your calendar rules your life. And I'm not saying that Google Calendar rules my life, but I'm saying that if you were to look at my calendar, you could tell pretty quickly what's most important to me. And if I were to look at your calendar, I could tell pretty quickly what's most important to you. If we were to look at the things that your family does together on a daily basis, or on a weekly, monthly, and yearly basis, we'd have a pretty good sense of your family values. If we look at the things that your church community does together on a regular basis, similar, we kind of see the things that are important. And a lot of times we don't necessarily even think about some of the rituals that we go through, but the value of these things is to back up and to say, like, when God brought these people from slavery, He wanted them to understand that He was their king and that their lives were called to be different. So I want you to picture this in its historical context. I maybe have jumped a little bit too quickly to application. Let's remember that we're talking about Israel, who has been enslaved for 400 years, and now they're free. So they've been under the thumb of the Pharaoh of Egypt and of the Egyptian gods for as much longer than any of them can remember. And all of a sudden they're free. And one of the first things that God does is He says, all right, we're going to set up a new calendar because you need to understand that I am your king. I, the one who delivered you, who gave you the law, and who guided you through the wilderness. I am the one who will determine your steps. I'm the one from whom you will take your cues and live. And so He tells them not just to remember these things, but He builds in particular festivals and rituals so that they remember these things. This is a fairly common thing when you think about empires and kings, is that when a new empire takes over the world or a part of the world, often they will institute a new calendar. When a new king comes to reign, often they will regard this as year 0, We don't think a whole lot necessarily about the meaning of calling a particular year 2022 or 2023 or 2024, but that's like not a natural feature of the world. It isn't like all of a sudden we crossed from the negatives to the positives, except that that's the way we tell time because of certain people who were running the world in a political sense at a particular point in time. So the point here is whatever regulates your calendar rules your life. The other thing I want to note here is that there is a sense in which, we'll just draw a symbol here, that these things look back in order to look ahead. So you're looking back on the things that God has done in order to establish you as a people. But I want you to notice that especially with a couple of these longer festivals, the ones that last a week, after the week you have this 8th-day celebration. And the 8th-day celebration is always a symbol of the new creation that God is bringing about. And certainly as Israel's history wore on and they realized that things did not continue to stay as they were in their happiest times, these festivals would continue to be celebrated and they became very dangerous political moments. During the time of Jesus and Paul in the New Testament, whenever the Jews would celebrate these festivals, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, Passover was the most important one because it's the Freedom Festival. Pentecost is also dangerous because it's the one, given the better weather, even 50 days later, that was most frequently most populated in the city. The Romans would put extra guards in the city because there's this fervor of freedom and liberation, and our God liberated us once and he'll do us again. And what I'm saying is that they celebrate these festivals as a way of remembering their past, but they also celebrate these festivals as a way of looking forward to the future. It might be important for us to note here that whenever Jesus explained the meaning of his death, he did so not by pointing to a theory, but by pointing to a meal. The meal of Passover and the way Jesus reinterprets it to point to him is critical for our understanding of what he's come to do for us. Whenever the Holy Spirit came down and filled the church so that she could continue the mission of Jesus, it didn't happen on a random day. It happened at the day of Pentecost. Just as God gave his law for the people to know how to move forward, so God gave his Spirit and ushered them on in mission. And so we actually can look back now from the vantage point of Christ and the Spirit and recognize the ways in which these festivals were always a celebration of God's past deliverance, but an anticipation of God's future deliverance. And that deliverance is ours in Jesus, which just flags the question, okay, so how? What do we do with these things? What do we do when we read this portion of the text? Are we supposed to celebrate these festivals? Are we supposed to come up with our own festivals? And I confess to you that this is an issue that's not at all black and white. There are some black and whites, but I think it's a little bit of a gray area, and I think it's actually supposed to be. So a couple of markers I think we can keep in place is, in the negative sense, we are not called to practice these festivals literally or legalistically. A couple of passages that I'll mention and encourage you to take a look at are Romans chapter 14 and 15. Paul is talking about a group of Christians, some are Jews, some are Gentiles, and they're trying to figure out how to manage different opinions about which days are sacred and which are not. And he says very clearly, if you want to celebrate a particular day as sacred, go for it. If you want to see all days as equally sacred, go for it, but leave each other alone. I also think about Colossians chapter 2, which talks about calendar observations in actually some pretty negative ways. As some people lean into some of these different rituals, thinking these rituals are going to make them holy. And Paul makes the negative point there. Hey, listen, no, don't expect these things to automatically make you more like Jesus. You can lean into some of these practices if they help you become more like Jesus, but absolutely stay away from them if you're expecting too much from them. And don't impose them on anyone else as a burden. And so the New Testament, when it comes to the actual practice of these things, is actually, I'd say, primarily negative in the sense of don't get caught up in thinking that there are certain festivals and calendar observations that you have to follow. No, you have Jesus, who is the fulfillment of these things. Also, can't help but think about the Christian calendar year. And depending on your church tradition, maybe you guys make much of the Christian calendar year. Most of us celebrate Christmas and Easter at the very least. And so I think this is where you would want to arrive at, frame it as an issue of discernment. What I think we need to do as individuals, but especially as family units or groups of friends, and then as larger congregations and maybe even networks of churches, I think we are called and invited to discern how best to organize our time together in ways that draw us into a celebration of what God has done, an attentiveness to what he's doing, and an anticipation of what he's going to do in the future. So that's the final word that I would suggest to you from this text, is that what it invites us to do is, first and foremost, celebrate the ways in which Jesus has fulfilled, in which God has fulfilled through Christ and the Spirit in the church, what all of these various festivals were pointing forward to. And then from there, when it comes to the question of, we want to remember and we want to regulate our calendars, the call and the invitation is to discern proper rhythms that remind, define, and realign, that remind us of what God has done, that define us as his people in particular ways, and that realign our lives with him. I will continue to pray for you as you together discern how best to put those things into practice in your own time and place. As for now, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace.